from Washington, D.C.
The strait is already partially opened. As you know, they're doing a little hunting for a couple of mines that they've already found. But it's essentially ships are starting to go out now. On Friday, it'll be completely opened.
Tonight, a done deal. The U.S. and Iran say they've agreed on a plan to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a key step toward ending their conflict. Equities climb globally, the NASDAQ 100 rising more than 3% and the Dow hitting a fresh record. But questions still linger as shippers and oil markets look for clarity on how the critical waterway can safely reopen. And the world stage against the backdrop of a newly announced U.S.-Iran deal, group of 7 leaders gather in France. Also looming large, Russia's war in Ukraine. We'll discuss the latest and what European allies can do in the conflict with the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. this hour. Plus, model behavior. Anthropic executives meet with White House officials after a sweeping administration order forced the AI giant to shut down access to its most advanced models. More details on the latest and what Washington's AI crackdown means for the broader industry this hour. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Joe Matthew has the night off. And we kick off our coverage tonight in France, where President Trump spent the day convening with world leaders fresh off of coming to a deal with Iran. Trump saying a memo of understanding with the fine details of the deal would be released soon, with a signing ceremony expected in Switzerland on Friday. Still, we have fresh reports of consternation among Europe's leaders over the president's repeated assertions that the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened by Friday as Iran dominates much of the G7 summit. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is covering the summit for us and joins us now live from Geneva. So, Tyler, walk us through whether we can expect anything deliverable from this summit in terms of European commitments to free transit in the Strait of Hormuz, as they promised they would be involved once this conflict was over.
Kaylee, that is perhaps one of the biggest questions and maybe one of the areas where we actually could see some tangible agreement, because so far our reporting has indicated that G7 officials are concerned that they may not even get to a joint communique when it comes to Iran, though we did seem to get some assurances earlier today from some European allies, including France, Germany, and the UK, who did reiterate that they would be ready to deploy military assets in the event that we really see pen put to paper later this week here in Switzerland. It's raising, though, concerns from our allies about just how quickly the U.S. Has said that the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened, though I will add that a senior administration official who briefed us reporters earlier today did acknowledge that the U.S. understands that it is going to take time to see the strait fully restored to pre-conflict flows, and that's for a few reasons. One is that there's still mines, apparently, in the strait. We've heard U.S. officials publicly acknowledge that. And two, this official did talk about what appears to still be concern and a wariness among global shippers that the strait is safe to transit. In fact, our own reporting at Bloomberg News indicates that many of these shippers are actively reaching out to governments, trying to form a clearer picture on exactly what assurances will ultimately be put in this deal. Because, Kaylee, earlier today we heard from Iranian state media, which said, yes, the Strait of Hormuz will be opened toll-free for 60 days. But then there are questions about the longer-term security here, including Iran seeming to indicate that there are plans to charge fees related to navigational, insurance, and environmental services once that ceasefire extension is over.
Well, Tyler, we also heard from President Trump today as he met with French President Emmanuel Macron that he would like to shift his focus to the war between Russia and Ukraine. Should we expect the president to meet with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy on the sidelines of the summit tomorrow?
So, Kaylee, as of now, he does have a broader meeting scheduled with the other G7 leaders and the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. We are waiting to see if an individual bilateral meeting will get added to the schedule. We do know that the pair of leaders did speak by phone over the weekend, and that President Trump also spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Trump is saying that if the conflict with Iran can be resolved to some extent, to the extent that we're seeing with this extension and phased-in negotiation, then perhaps there could be movement when it comes to the negotiations regarding Ukraine, because at this point we've really seen progress stalled. And, Kaylee, over the weekend we saw Ukraine take some pretty big offensive attacks against Russia, including targeting a petrochemical facility and a fuel depot.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live late night in Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us. And joining me now for more on this and other subjects is Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada, a member of the House Foreign Affairs and Transportation Committees. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to have you. If we could begin with your reaction to the news of at least what is an interim deal between the United States and Iran. Is this good for the country?
Well, it seems to me a tacit agreement that we could have done all of this through diplomacy. Not any of the big reasons why Trump started this war of choice have really been resolved. Not the nuclear issue. There's been no regime change. Israel's role with Lebanon is still uncertain. Was there ever an imminent threat? We could have done all of this by staying at the negotiating table, because we really haven't come out ahead. We're worse off than before the war started. So it's kind of like, well, why did we do it?
Well, you mentioned Israel, Congresswoman. President Trump has been critical of Israel's continued strikes on Lebanon and Hezbollah in Lebanon, I should clarify. Do you see Israel as an impediment to a lasting ceasefire or negotiated agreement in the Middle East? What leverage should the U.S. exercise to make sure that Israel stays in line?
Well, I don't think insulting their head of state really is going to go very far. Israel is a strong ally and was part of the reason that we got involved in the first place. So I think they need to be at the table if they're going to be part of this so-called deal, just like the allies of Europe that the president's talking to now. In Paris, they weren't consulted. They weren't part of the whole war from the beginning. And now he's asking them to help clean up the mess. I don't know that they're going to be all that excited about it either, because the bottom line is people just don't trust the U.S. One day it's one thing and the next day it's something else.
Well, when we consider what Europe said that they would get involved in after the conflict was over, it was ensuring the free flow of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Congresswoman, if we do indeed see the Strait back open, the president contends that it will be by Friday. How quickly do you expect that to translate into lower prices at the pump for your constituents and for Americans more broadly?
Well, that's been the one consequence of this war, is that gas prices have gone so high, and people are certainly feeling it, and they know what's caused it. You can't just turn something around overnight. So all the economists say it will take several months before you really feel the long-term impact at the pump. Also, you can't just open the Strait overnight. You mentioned that there are bombs to be cleared. What's the security of the Strait? Maybe they won't charge fees for 60 days, but that could change because we don't see the details. So we are leaving Iran in greater control of the Strait than they had before we went to war. So that's not an improvement in situation either.
Well, the president contends that once this situation is complete and the Strait of Hormuz is back open, he would like to shift his focus to the war between Russia and Ukraine and bringing that to an end. What role, Congresswoman, do you see the U.S. playing in that? Is it really just a matter of approving further funding and arms for Ukraine, as we saw the House do earlier this month?
Well, that's part of it. And certainly the House has done a discharge petition to call for greater support for Ukraine and more sanctions on Russia. So it's two parts. He's got to quit cozying up to Putin at the same time that we supply arms for Ukraine. Here again, one day it's one thing, one day it's the next. But he's so good at changing the attention or changing the news cycle. You know, it was Venezuela, then it was Cuba, then it was Colombia, then who remembers Gaza? Now it's the war in Iran that didn't produce what he had hoped. So we're back to Ukraine.
Well, I'd also like to ask you, Congresswoman, about other matters that were before the House before you left for recess, and that would be extension of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Obviously, that extension was not passed, and there was bipartisan opposition to it. Part of what Democrats' concern was that Bill Pulte is being tapped as the acting director of national intelligence. If Jay Clayton, who the president last week nominated to serve in that position, permanently. If he is able to be confirmed by the Senate this week, are you prepared to cast a vote to reauthorize FISA powers?
Well, not necessarily. He'd certainly be an improvement over Pulte, who had absolutely no experience and no knowledge in the area of security, and who had proven that he would use his authority at a government agency to go after some of the president's enemies. That's not what national security is supposed to be all about. We want some reassurances that people's confidential information will be protected, and I don't know that this administration, with its whole attitude in the Justice Department, even in the Commerce Department, it assures people of that.
Well, of course, the president also says now that he won't support a FISA extension if the Save America Act is not included. Does that have any chance of making it through the House, Congresswoman?
Well, it might make it through the House because you've got a lot of sycophants for the president who are members of the House. The Senate has said pretty emphatically that it wouldn't get through the Senate, even if it came out of the House. But as we move towards the election season, I think that public opinion is going to play a stronger role against Republicans in those swing districts. So maybe you'll start to see a few of them veer off, like you have on the discharge petitions that were signed and passed in recent weeks.
Well, and the president did try to get the Save America Act attached to the budget reconciliation package that just passed. That obviously was unsuccessful, though reconciliation without that did get through. Congresswoman, there's a live conversation as to whether or not we will see a reconciliation 3.0 effort on Capitol Hill. If it were to include tax provisions, like, for example, a tweaking of the gambling provisions that were included in Reconciliation 1.0, the One Big Beautiful Act last year, would you find yourself supporting that? Is that actually potentially the best vehicle to get something like that through?
I doubt that there will be a third Reconciliation Act. You're certainly hearing that kind of from the leadership of both houses, especially the Senate, in terms of those finance committees. It would be hard for me to vote against a provision I've worked so hard to get passed that would take away that 90% deduction for gaming losses. But it really depends on what else is in the bill. Just like I couldn't vote for the last one because it was just carte blanche with more money for ICE with absolutely no restrictions on their activities. So let's wait and see what else is in such a bill. If it has the SAVE Act, I certainly couldn't support that.
Is there any other vehicle through which you could see your legislation getting through in this Congress?
Well, we have said that we'll use any vehicle. I've got a bill. There are other bills been introduced after mine by other members of Congress. There's always a tax extender bill at the end of the session, kind of like a Christmas tree. A lot of things get hung on it. Also, we'll look for the amendment process when we get to appropriations as a possibility. So there's still a number of options.
All right, Congresswoman, thanks for joining us. Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada. We appreciate it. Well, the Dow jumped, hitting a new all-time high today as oil sank and other stocks beyond those in the Dow Industrial Average surged following the news of a deal between the U.S. and Iran. Today also marking the first full day of trading for SpaceX as investors look to the ongoing AI race for the next big IPO in the works. Let's get into all of this now as we turn to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Yeah, a bit of a tongue twister here on this Monday afternoon, Kaylee, but ultimately what this is about is an improvement in risk sentiment. The market seems to be hanging their hat on the idea that the president is indeed potentially nudging us forward to some sort of resolution with the situation in Iran, and more importantly, a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. A big part of the reason why you saw the Dow rally here on this Monday afternoon, about 500 points higher than where it was to start the day, up about 1%, about 2% points higher on the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ indices each up about 3% on the day. And this was a global rally, we should point out. For our television viewers, that 4% number on the second line of your screen, that's the Nikkei benchmark over in Japan. In fact, Asia shares really benefiting the most from some of the rhetoric out of the president, as of course they have been hardest hit by that big increase that we saw in oil prices. And I want you to flip up the screen here because it was that drop in oil prices that was a big part of the impetus for the rally that we saw in equity markets. Right now you're looking at WTI crude right around $81 a barrel and Brent crude right around $83 a barrel. We should point out this is a big change from where we were back in sort of late March, early April, when we were about $118 on Brent crude and about 112 on WTI. But I'd be remiss in not pointing out that we are still well above where we were in late February, when crude prices, at least here in the U.S., were right around $65 a barrel, and gas was below $3 a gallon at the pump. Now, as far as some of the other individual movers that you were talking about, Kaylee, SpaceX did rally once again. Remember, it surged about 19% on Friday. It came again here on this Monday afternoon, as a lot of people really trying to pile in and take advantage of what a lot of people think is going to be the next big thing, not just in the stock market, but more importantly, in the universe. But we did also see an interesting reaction when it came to Fox. An interesting story here. Fox is going to buy Roku. Now, they're only paying roughly what amounts to about $143 a share, depending on how you take it. But you see the shares plunge there for Fox, down about 17%. And that's largely because of some concerns as to why they're buying a company that, quite frankly, has been in a bit of a decline. This idea that maybe they can find some value and some leverage there, but at least for right now, Fox shareholders not necessarily on board completely with what this company is doing.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic in New York. Thank you so much. Still ahead, a late-night Russian strike on Kyiv sees a historic UNESCO World Heritage Site lit ablaze. We'll dive into the other major issue being discussed at the G7, the war in Ukraine, when the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Now that this is finished, we're going to be focusing on that, see if we can get that one done. 25,000 people a month are dying, mostly soldiers, and that shouldn't happen. But I had two very good conversations yesterday. We'll be talking about it.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. Joe Matthew has the night off. And that was President Trump earlier today, speaking in a bilateral meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron ahead of this week's G7 summit, which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is expected to attend tomorrow, with Russia's war against his country high on the agenda. The summit coming on the heels of a Russian drone and missile strike that left an Orthodox cathedral in Kyiv, a historic UNESCO-protected site, in flames, several dead and dozens injured. Russia's defense minister claims the cathedral was hit by a, quote, expired U.S.-made Patriot missile fired by Ukraine, without providing any evidence. And joining us now for more on the state of the war is Ukrainian Ambassador to the US Olha Stefanishyna. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here on Bloomberg. If we could begin with the G7 summit taking place in France this week, which your president is attending. What is Ukraine hoping to get in terms of outcomes from the summit?
Well, thank you so much. First and foremost, for us, it's really important that the summit begins hours after the completion of the deal with Iran, meaning that the leaders will be able to fully concentrate on the next steps and the next priorities. And we were absolutely positive to hear that the President Trump, being already in Europe, has confirmed that Ukraine and ending this war is the priority he has right now after this major engagement completed. And we have seen a confirmation of that over his meeting with President of France, President Macron, where they really prioritize the discussion of Ukraine. Of course, our president is preparing to see President Trump, and there are like quite a new amount of issues on the table to be discussed after the major deal on Iran has been completed.
Is it ultimately positive for Ukraine for the U.S. to be more involved in this process, knowing that at times, at least, it has seemed that the president is more sympathetic to the views of the Kremlin than to Kyiv?
Well, basically, I think we should not forget that there is a real pattern behind any serious negotiations or discussion taking place. Ahead of the one of the last summits of NATO, Russians attacked the major kids' hospital where the cancer-cured kids are being placed, and it was happening in the front of all of the world. And yesterday, the attack on the oldest church in the whole world, it's like 1,000 years old church, which is basically the motherland of the Christianity, has been deliberately attacked by Russians, and they would not even recognize that. That means that the meetings over the next day are really important, and Russia is really afraid that there will be a time when they need to come back to the table and be forced to stop this aggression. And U.S. role is absolutely vital here.
Well, and while clearly Russia is still able to land some significant blows against Ukraine, Ukraine has made advances of its own, including territorial advances. Is it still Ukraine's ambition here to resolve this through a negotiated process versus trying to make further military gains, as we are seeing a lot of that being accomplished?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. So it should be very clear. It's not like the war, and it's like classic understanding. So Ukraine has been attacked. Ukrainian cities has been targeted, and the people of Ukraine has been targeted. And Ukraine is absolutely effective and capable of its defense. This is what we do to secure the front line, to control the air and the space, and we do beyond possible. We need more support to secure our skies and our houses, while the diplomatic effort is ongoing. And now, when the new momentum has been built up, we need to be even more secured. Our people need to feel secure while we're giving the best towards diplomacy.
Well, so what is it that Ukraine needs most from the U.S. Right now? As we know, Ukraine is producing more of its own munitions. You talk about your drone technology. What can the U.S. deliver that it's not currently that would be able to aid Ukraine in this?
Before the world would prepare to this new reality created by the Russian aggression, the new reality is already happening in Ukraine. Russia attacks Ukraine with 60, 90, and even more missiles combined, including ballistics. That's why, while we're developing the capabilities which will be able to respond to that, we really need U.S. to help us, to back up us with the air defense. And the missiles for Patriot systems, which are placed in Ukraine, they're absolutely vital for economy, for the security, for air defense, but also first and foremost for Ukrainian people who stay in Ukraine, who keep this country running.
Well, and President Zelenskyy has publicly called for more Patriot systems. Has there been any progress in those conversations around Patriot specifically with the United States?
Well, this week on Thursday, the defense minister of NATO, including the U.S. defense minister in Europe, we call him defense minister, but the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, will participate. This will be a top priority for a discussion, and I hope that some announcements will be taking place already on Thursday.
Well, and finally, in our final moment, Ambassador, in terms of the immediate priorities, knowing that there will be other European leaders and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the G7 summit this week, what is the conversation like around Ukraine's membership to the European Union?
Well, the political barriers have been lifted after the last political developments within the European Union. Any decision on Ukraine's admission to EU requires the unanimous vote of all the states. We have this unanimous vote. There is no obstacle to that, so we are running the full speed, and we will make sure that it's going to happen.
How quickly could it happen?
Well, depends on who's doing it, but I'm sure Ukrainians have proven that we can do something which was not possible. And, whatever deadline you will hear, cut it by 2, we will do it much faster.
All right, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us live in our Washington, D.C. studio. The Ukrainian Ambassador to the United States, Olha Stefanishyna. We appreciate your time. And still ahead, the president says the Strait of Hormuz will be fully reopened by Friday. How is that possible? And what would it take militarily to ensure safe passage? We'll get into those questions when retired general and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Wesley Clark joins us next. As we consider Vice President J.D. Vance speaking in an interview on CNN, says the memorandum of understanding with Iran is only about a page and a half. He calls it a very general document. We'll have more ahead on Bloomberg.
It'll take through the end of this month before it's really safe and clear for those boats to start moving through Hormuz again. You've got to sign the agreement, you've got to get the insurance in place, and then you have to make sure the channels are clear of mines. A trickle will become a stream if all goes well, if the MOU sticks.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Advisors speaking with me earlier today on the president's repeated claims that the Strait of Hormuz will be, quote, completely reopened, toll-free, by Friday. But is that really possible? And what will it look like? Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Becca Wasser, defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. So, Becca, we heard the president in France earlier today suggest that the Strait will be completely open by Friday, but it already partially is. What are we actually seeing in terms of transit through the Strait as we speak?
I'm not sure the Strait is open as the president envisions. You know, as things have become more clear, it seems as though upon the official signing of the deal on Friday, that's when the Strait is reportedly going to be open. But I think there's a lot of time between now and then, and we're going to see a lot of what's happening with shipping, where we're already starting to see some clusters, some backup, if you will. And part of that is really going to be down to commercial shippers. Do they want to have the risk tolerance to assume that maybe they want to go through a strait that they're not sure whether it's mined or not? We've seen that there is this, southern route that ships have taken largely under U.S. guidance in the past that seems to be free of mines, but that's very narrow. So you can only get so many ships out at one time. So it really comes down to a risk tolerance that we see. And also, are they just tired of being in the Strait and laden with various goods? And do they want to get to their next port, whether that's Dubai or elsewhere?
Well, you say that specific route seems to be clear of mines. How long realistically will it take to clear waters that could be littered with mines in different spots, and we're just not sure?
It definitely depends on how many mines are in the water. I think it also really depends on who decides to contribute to that effort. We have seen the Europeans talk about maybe coming into the Strait, coming in to help clear of mines, but, we'll see exactly when that happens, because once again, it's about a variety of risk tolerances that those capitals have.
Well, and of course, we know that the U.S. intends to end its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, but what should we know about the overall military presence in the Middle East, and what kind of drawdown, if any, we should realistically expect in the near term?
So I don't think we should expect a drawdown, at least in the next 60 days, as they are working through the specifics of the agreement. But you can see that there are all of these bases throughout the region where the U.S. forces have been there for years and years and years, and that's fixed infrastructure. So what you might see is a reduction in forces that showed up after the war started, and as part of that buildup to pressure Iran. Maybe those will go home or to other places around the world. But I think as far as things are concerned, Iran would like to see all U.S. forces out of the region, but I don't think that's likely to happen. So I expect U.S. force posture to remain likely as is for the foreseeable future.
So if that also means, if we're staying as is, that there's an allocation of resources still in the Middle East, what resources does the U.S. still have able to deploy, if necessary, given how much munitions have already been spent throughout the course of this conflict?
We've seen an enormous amount of forces and resources put toward this conflict, in part because you can see that there is a large degree of strikes that have occurred during the Iran war. We recently compiled all of the strikes that President Trump has greenlit around the globe, and the preponderance of them were during the Iran war. So there's a lot of forces that are tied up in the Middle East right now, but the U.S. truly is a global military, and right now it's drawing on some additional support forces to be able to undertake its steady state activities.
All right, Becca Wasser, defense lead at Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much. And joining me now for more on this conversation is retired General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe and former commander for U.S. Southern Command. General, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. As Becca was just outlining for us, she expects there to be zero change to the U.S.'s force posture in the Middle East right now. How much longer is that realistically going to be sustainable when we consider how long these forces have been deployed?
Well, we've got 2 aircraft carrier groups there. We've got 2 MEUs there. I hope we'll hold those there until we get a satisfactory result from the 60 days of negotiation. Once those forces depart, then the leverage that we have decreases further. Just saying we're going to open the straits and everything's okay already reduces our leverage. This negotiation period of 60 days it's the really tough part of this. Everything depends on how that negotiation goes. And I saw where President Trump tweeted now he's going to focus on Ukraine. Well, please, Mr. President, don't move away from this too soon, because there are huge issues residing here that haven't been resolved.
So do you believe, General, that it would have been more beneficial for the United States to continue its military campaign for longer to make these issues easier to resolve, ultimately to have more leverage against Iran at the negotiating table?
I think the air campaign was running out of really good targets. That's what happens with air campaigns. You hit everything you've seen in the database, and you hit some of them again. But eventually you run out of the targets. You might be striking empty buildings, warehouses that have been evacuated, former air defense sites. You might strike a couple of decoys. Eventually, the juicy, lucrative targets that you looked at and you briefed the Secretary of War on and you thought were going to be just critical and really crush Iran, it doesn't happen with an air campaign. I know, because I did it for 11 weeks. But what we could have done, and what I wanted to see continued, was the what was called the freedom effort in the Gulf. We could have taken out Iran's ability to impede traffic through the Gulf. Would it have been perfect? No. Would it have happened overnight? No. But it's what Admiral Cooper was moving toward. Every time he did retaliatory strikes, those strikes went into the Gulf, because that is the center of gravity of Iran's resistance. And what they believe they have right now is the wherewithal, legally and by force, to control the Strait of Hormuz and to use it as they see fit for their own benefit. And this is a big, big change. So this is one of the huge sticking points in this negotiation. They say, okay, for 60 days we won't take tolls, but after that, well, there'll be a service fee. Sure, but that means the end of the law of the sea, where we've restricted countries that border on these choke points from making a lot of money out of it. So if that happens, look out for the Straits of Malacca, the Taiwan Straits, and every other choke point that's important. And it really will impact shipping. It also provides an immediate opportunity to, in a crisis, cause more difficulty. So that's a huge issue that's lying on the table. On the nuclear issue,
sure.
It's about how we structure our ability to verify. They say they won't have a nuclear bomb. Now, how are we going to make sure of that? Because someone there is saying, look here, look, we've watched the United States. They're sneaky. They're mean. They're going to come after us again. This is all a trick. And as soon as we've seen that they wouldn't attack North Korea because they have nuclear weapons, we have to have our nuclear weapon to be safe. Somebody's saying that in Iran right now. I don't know who it is, and there'll be an argument. Yeah. And if we don't have full inspection, verification authority, that's not going to work. We were worried about regime change in missiles when we started. The missiles issue has fallen off the table, but we really impeded their ability to launch missiles by striking the entrances to the missile cities, but they were so deeply buried that we didn't really get inside the missile cities. And so now they've scraped out the entrances, rebuilt some of them, and they've got access to a lot of missiles. And China and Russia have continued to provide them new technology and propellant for these missiles, as well as targeting. So they're feeling their oats. So we've got to have leverage. We've got to be really tough in this set of negotiations. We can't just say, okay.
So, General,
you know,
as you describe this existing, pardon my interruption, but as you describe this existing missile capability and the idea that we would need firm verification on its nuclear program, why should Israel feel confident about the threat from Iran that it wanted addressed? Should they feel confident that it will be adequately addressed, or would you expect them to potentially continue on militarily in their own interests?
Well, I think Israel doesn't feel comfortable right now with this. From what I hear from Israeli friends, they are concerned because, first of all, Hezbollah is still there, threatening Israel in the north. And they're not part of the agreement. So they can be armed and supported by Iran. So if the United States gives $24 billion to Iran during the 60-day period, where do you think that money's going to go? That money's going to go to rebuilding Hezbollah and strengthening maybe the Shia militia that are Iranian-backed in Iraq that attacked our forces. So that money's not going to go to buy, food and rebuild water and bridges and so forth inside Iran. It's going to go to military hardware. And so Israel is right to be concerned. But again, the United States is the leader here. We're in the driver's seat. We can hold the Iranians to the terms that we demand, and we have leverage over them. We just can't give up on that leverage too soon.
Well, and as you are encouraging the U.S. to stay focused on this effort, General, the president already said today that he wants to shift his focus to ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. This issue with Iran aside, how helpful can the United States be in precipitating the end of that conflict, either with military aid or diplomatic aid? Which one is likely to prevail?
In Ukraine, the Ukrainians have done an amazing job of turning the tables on the Russians. Unlike what was said in February of 2025, Ukraine does have cards, and they're cutting off Russian logistics in the Zaporizhia region and also in the ability of the Russians to maintain themselves in Crimea. They're also using their drone technology, long-range drones, to wreck the oil processing and pipeline facilities throughout Russia, including in places like St. Petersburg. So they're in the driver's seat. And the question is then, what will the United States do? We've been very slow to provide them additional military assistance for the last 2 years. We've said that the Europeans have to buy it. We know they need Patriots, and Zelenskyy has begged for these Patriots because the Russians are tripling their production of ballistic missiles with assistance from China, of course, and some U.S. parts that have been smuggled in. And so we know that some of these missiles are not easily intercepted. And we don't know what Putin has in mind. He may really double down on the destruction of population centers, as he did in Syria. And so the United States has to provide military assistance, even as it encourages a peace agreement.
All right, General, thank you for joining us. Retired General Wesley Clark, we appreciate your time. And coming up, the biggest AI export restriction yet. The Trump administration ordering Anthropic to disable access to its most advanced models for all foreign nationals. The U.S. concerns that led to that restriction, and Anthropic's meeting with officials at the Commerce Department today. Up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. A major escalation in Washington's love-hate relationship with AI after the Trump administration ordered Anthropic this weekend to block foreign access to its most advanced models after discovering cyber guardrails could be jailbroken. The directive comes amid an ongoing battle between Anthropic and the Pentagon after the AI company was blacklisted and labeled a supply chain risk to national security because of its demands for restrictions on the military's use of its tools. Joining us now for more on this is Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. So, Mike, when we considered these export controls, if you will, it led to both Mythos and Fable 5 having to be pulled entirely. How does this get resolved? I know there was a meeting at the Commerce Department about it today.
We're still waiting to hear, Kaylee, from the results from this meeting and whether it would actually lead to a quick resolution. And it's unclear exactly what the remedial steps the company would have to take would actually be. The government hasn't spelled out publicly exactly what its concerns are. David Sachs over the weekend, the former White House AI czar, signaled that it had something to do with a jailbreak capability, and that is that the safeguards that Anthropic had put around its Fable 5 product, which is a cyber-safe version of Mythos, which is only available to a very small select group of large banks and big tech companies, that those safeguards could be somehow circumvented. And that raised immediate concerns within the administration that perhaps Fable 5 could become the kind of devastating cyber tool that everybody had been fearing for weeks. We've been hearing about that since April. But whether the company can quickly respond to those concerns really remains to be seen. We'll learn more. It's important to note Howard Lutnick is traveling right now with President Donald Trump, so he's not physically present here for these discussions, and it's unclear who else would need to be involved, too.
Well, of course, President Trump is at the G7 summit in France this week, where leaders of big AI companies are supposed to be as well. I would imagine this might color some of those conversations.
Well, it certainly will, and it just highlights the stakes here, really, for the Trump administration as it takes these steps. Really, just like everybody else, they are feeling their way through this AI boom. What does it mean? What is the revolution going to require in terms of a government response to address both the risks, but also to seize upon the opportunities? And for the U.S., the constant call from leaders in this administration, the past administration, and also members of Congress to maintain what they see as a lead over China in this technology. China has been investing heavily, just like the U.S., and it has also been pushing its own AI developers to really try to catch up. So the U.S. is mindful of this, and this sort of step by forcing Anthropic essentially to disable two of its leading products also raises questions among allies who the president will be meeting with. What is going to happen to our ability to this? And does this mean we need to rely more on ourselves and declare more of this tech sovereignty that we've seen EU officials try to assert lately?
All right. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, thank you so much. And joining me now for more is this evening's political panel, Democratic strategist Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, a democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, and Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Welcome to you both. Obviously, as we were just discussing with Mike, AI is probably going to feature somewhat at the G7 summit, but I would imagine the whole thing is going to be more largely colored by the fact that there is a deal in hand between the U.S. and Iran set to be signed in Geneva on Friday. Is that the only diplomatic victory the president needs this week? Does he need to walk away from the G7 with anything in hand, Rick?
I don't think he really has an outcome in the G7. I think this is, and I use this very sparingly, a victory lap for Donald Trump. Remember, a year ago, he left early because he was bored and didn't like the team that was assembled there. And this year, I think he's going to use the venue to basically take credit for solving the crisis in Iran. Yeah, some would say a crisis he himself only created to solve. But at the end of the day, the leaders in Europe are going to be happy with the outcome. They don't want to see a war break out again in the Middle East, and they desperately need the hydrocarbons that are still locked up in the Gulf.
Well, yeah, and the president says that lower gas prices will come quickly with the Strait of Hormuz reopening. Jeannie, the question politically is the midterms approach is whether or not that's too late.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, they've already gotten lower. I mean, I've noticed that, Kaylee, when I filled up my car. But, of course, they're not low enough, and they're nowhere near where they were on February 27th before he started this war of choice. And you listen to some of the experts, they say it's going to take time for the Strait of Hormuz and for the oil to start moving, the fertilizer and everything else. And that's, of course, if it does, because we have sort of a long way to go until Friday, when this memo gets signed potentially. And then, of course, so many things can get in the way when you're talking about peace and stability in the Middle East.
Well, if an ultimate long-term deal gets signed, if it takes the form of a treaty, Rick, there's the question of whether or not it's going to have to be approved by Congress and the Senate specifically. Senator Lindsey Graham suggested that he would want to have a vote on this. He also suggested that Vice President J.D. Vance, as the architect of this deal, would need to talk to the Senate about this. What do you make of that?
Yeah, first of all, I think that the Senate has a lot of unanswered questions, and so they do want someone who's been in the middle of these conversations to come up and explain to them what exactly the commitments are and what the promises are being made while it's all being negotiated, because, as you know, we still have 60 days to try and get to an actual agreement that then Congress, under traditional circumstances, would be a part of, because they have the power to create treaties. The President of the United States can't create a treaty. And, of course, you would want, as a country, the strongest possible commitment that you can get from a country like Iran, which in a very short period of time is probably going to violate that treaty, and then you're going to want Congress behind you. You want it to be as much their treaty as it is yours. But this administration has skirted those kind of traditions, and it wouldn't surprise me that they probably leave Congress in the dark on this one, too.
I'd like to ask you about another subject, Jeannie. As we learned this afternoon via a video statement from California's Governor Gavin Newsom that the Department of Justice has opened an investigation into him and his wife. The DOJ hasn't confirmed what they're looking into here, but I wonder how you read this, as obviously we have seen this DOJ go after quite a few individuals who are perceived enemies of the president. I just have to wonder if this actually may be advantageous to this particular enemy who openly said in his statement that he's considering a run for president in 2028.
Yeah, that's right. And I think both things can be true. We've seen Donald Trump. We've seen his DOJ go after his political enemies. And again, we don't know, at least I don't know, the truth of this and what is going on. Of course, this is all happening as Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche potentially goes up sooner than later for a confirmation hearing, which is interesting. But of course, we're talking about Gavin Newsom, the governor who has made his name of late attacking the president, and who is going to benefit from this because, of course, this is the way to get your name out there and to raise money. And the Democratic base wants nothing more than people to be going after the president and holding him accountable for what they say are misdeeds of an impeachable order at this point. And we even heard that from AOC over the weekend.
Well, Jeannie raises Todd Blanche. Senator Chuck Grassley just told reporters on Capitol Hill, Rick, that the Blanche nomination hearing will be set for July. How tough is that one going to be in this Judiciary Committee?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough one. He has not really distinguished himself to Congress. He hasn't made a lot of time for members, especially the leadership of the Judiciary Committee, which he's got to get through first. And the margins are so small that he can't have two members decide that they're going to withhold their support. And, of course, there are plenty of grumpy Republican senators, considering the way that the White House has treated them over the course of the last couple of years. So it's a toxic mess to have to try to get confirmed in. And I would remind everybody, bad things happen in the summer in Washington. So the last thing you want to do is be a nominee going for confirmation in July or August.
Yeah, well, we didn't even get the chance to talk about the other thing that happened in a Washington summer this weekend with the UFC fight on the South Lawn of the White House, though judging by the orange and blue Jeannie is wearing today, I think the sporting event she was paying more attention to was the Knicks' victory against the Spurs in the NBA Finals on Saturday. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you both so much, as always, for joining. And, of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find that on the terminal and online. And you can find myself, Kaylee Lyons, back alongside Joe Matthew for tomorrow's edition of Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.